Something I've noticed over the last decade or so is that the left has completely abandoned atheism. And more than even abandoned it, they've kind of thrown it under the bus and they've started to make a lot of the new atheists explicit enemies. And we'll get into why in a minute. If you're wondering, this is a picture of a group of quote unquote clergy blessing an abortion clinic in Texas. So, if you're as old as me, you'll remember that in the 2000s, particularly the, I guess, mid to late 2000s, atheism seemed unstoppable. You had all these new atheists emerging, most notably Richard Dawkins. It kind of became one of the left's major causes to destroy religion, etc. And that mainly arose out of an opposition to creationism and conservative positions on sexual matters, such as abortion and gay marriage. And it was seen as a way, I think, of targeting the children of these families, particularly from evangelical families where the children weren't very well catechized. And there was kind of a tradition of what's known as fideism, which is you believe in something, but you acknowledge or you believe that there's no justification for it. So they basically, a lot of them are just kind of taught to believe in Jesus, but they aren't really taught anything about their faith, and they have no way to really defend it. So even though a lot of like Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists arguments are stuff that Christians responded to like over 1,000 years ago, sometimes they're even things that the apostolic and church fathers responded to. None of these kids really had any experience with that. So the first time they kind of encountered the attempt to make a systematic argument against Christianity, they kind of collapsed. There's also a lot of peer pressure at universities and that sort of thing. And I think in terms of undermining the next generation's pervasive Christianity and kind of reducing Christians among millennials, at least kind of sincere ones, to a minority, largely succeeded and let them win at the culture war on a number of issues. Nowadays, though, it seems like it's been completely thrown out in favor of an interesting kind of anti-secularism. So this is more a general observation or than anything, but pay close attention when kind of leftists talk about social justice issues, and you'll notice it's very common for them to make religious arguments, or I prefer to call it spiritual arguments, because it's not exclusively even really pretending to be Christian anymore. I mean, it used to be pretend to kind of be a liberal form of Christianity or a practical form of Christianity, but it's kind of moved beyond that into this like vague spirituality. But they are very willing to use religion to make these arguments. I think probably one of the most clear examples of this is when uh, Joe Biden and Paul Ryan were debating. And Paul Ryan said, I'm pro life because my faith teaches me that abortion is murder. And Biden said, I don't believe religion belongs anywhere in politics, and we're a secular country. But then later in the debate, he said, we have to have a social revolution because it's what Jesus would have wanted. So that's a very common perspective. And if you look at Black Lives Matter, they will, in one hand, say Christianity is racist and evil, but there's a lot of pastors and other religious officials that are very high up in it, and they will tout them out as much as possible, and they'll have them give speeches like how basically we need progressive Christianity to de facto be the state religion. We spiritually need to adopt like anti-racism. I mean, the whole thing has kind of taken a very hagiographic quality, particularly with regards to George Floyd. Like I know I had a diversity meeting at my company, and they made a whole bunch of like statements about how George Floyd is in heaven and he's watching down on us, and like pastors and progressive people are telling us like to save us and our salvation is dependent upon repenting from the original sin of racism. So what you'll do is you'll like get these people who will sue the city council if they say the Lord's Prayer at the start of meetings. I know in some cases in Canada, they've banned the national anthem from meetings because it says God keep our land in it. And that's not a joke, that actually happened. But they'll still have prayers. They'll bring in, I don't know, a Jewish person or some like super liberal Christian. In Canada, it's very common to force children to go to Native American religious ceremonies. I actually kind of, as a Catholic, I can't participate in them. So when I was working for the government, I pretended that the incense smoke they were burning affected my asthma, which was true, but you have to like participate in them. Like it's state required that you participate in pagan religious ceremonies. And I remember when I was in university, they taught us that Turtle Island was real, like objectively real, as part of the curriculum in one of my classes. To which I said scientifically it doesn't like work, and to which they said, well, it's you're deriding Native American beliefs, and their beliefs deserve to be respected and taught, but we can't teach that God created the universe. So it's very common to have this religious underpinning. Now, why did this emerge? It's an interesting question. I think the thing to keep in mind is there's certain things that only appeal to basically white people and specifically white males. Atheism is something that doesn't really appeal to non-whites. You might theoretically have state atheism, and like in Japan and China, you'll have people who won't say they believe in God necessarily. But when I say atheism, I kind of mean materialistic reductionism. That is, nothing exists other than the material. And that's not very common outside of basically white males. Like in China and Japan, people still believe in spirits, superstition, they'll still revere their ancestors, they'll still do stuff like that, even if they don't technically believe in any specific religion or believe in a creator deity. And like I said, it's not something like if you look at like blacks, I think almost none of them are atheists. It's very uncommon. In India, it's extremely uncommon. Even though the supposed atheists in India normally have some sort of anti-materialistic, or just they believe in supernatural things. They just think the universe is eternal or oscillating, as opposed to there being a definitive beginning to it. And even like a lot of forms of like theoretical atheism, they'll combine it with like Buddhism or something like that. I remember a friend of mine had a black friend, and we were in a conversation together, and he asked his black friend, "Are you an atheist?" And I just immediately said, "He's black. What do you think?" Of course not. There's like black science guy, and then that's about it. So I think they realized that that's not going to work. So they've switched from that into this vague liberation spirituality where they've tried to give this religious justification for all of their beliefs. Now, I guess we're going to get into the issue of how does that differ from Christians, people like myself. Well, I think on the most basic level, we aren't hypocritical about it. I don't believe in secularism. I've been pretty clear about that. I want us to live in a Christian society. And I think Christianity, although the denomination is kind of country dependent, is the state religion. It has a special place in society. And I've always been, well, I've been consistently adamant about that. So when I use religious justifications for things, I'm consistent about it. I don't scream about secularism. I don't believe in suing town councils for singing the national anthem or doing the Lord's Prayer or something. I support that. So there's not an inconsistency there. Whereas for people on the left, they'll scream about secularism, but then they will go further than the right does in terms of kind of advocating an almost theocratic form of government. And like I said, I think it's because that doesn't appeal, because the extreme secularism doesn't really appeal to non-whites. They don't really get it. You can try to explain it to them. They don't really understand. They need some sort of supernatural underpinning. I think the other aspect of it is, if we're going to deny the existence of some sort of supernatural objective morality, then there's absolutely no justification for any of the left stuff. I mean, let's think about it. Let's really think about it for a minute. If you're a white male and they're correct in this system of like systematic racism and oppression exists, what incentive do you have from our self-interest or rational perspective to dismantle that or change it? Your rational self-interest would be to make the system as strict as possible and make it as hard to change as possible. I don't really see how that's like even a controversial statement to make. So like, if we're going to say, okay, there's no God, there's no religion, there's no overarching morality, all we have is this world, then I think my natural thing would be, okay, so we should have kept slavery. There's no reason to get rid of slavery. There's no reason to not enslave people of the out group. There's no reason to not be brutal to them. Any attempt to kind of say that there is relies upon some sort of religious, spiritual, or supernatural underpinning. So I think what they kind of realized, if you notice with a lot of the atheists, is they were kind of heading in the direction of things like race realism, or they would still make like arguments for liberalism, but they had no teeth behind them and it didn't really make sense. Like from their perspective, race realism fits a lot better with materialistic reductionism than with some sort of spirituality. So I think that's an aspect of it, but I've thought about it at great length, and the only reason to not exterminate or enslave minorities from a rational perspective is that it might do damage to your society. That the level of brutality involved in that will make people like bad, and it'll cause disruption to your society. But in terms of some sort of like objective measure, I think rational self-interest says that that's a really, really bad idea. That's not going to help you out. It's not good for you or your society. But basically, what they decided to do was take existing aspects of religion and talk about how sincere they were. But ironically enough, their supposed religious inspiration is 100% the same as their political beliefs. They had their political beliefs, they adopted a religion or a spirituality, and it just winds up to be 100% the same and presents them with no moral quandaries and requires absolutely nothing on their part. They don't have to think morally seriously. They don't have to weigh competing goods and competing bads. They don't have to balance self-interest versus their religious obligations. It just happens to be exactly the same. Progressive Christianity loves abortion. It views it as a sacred act. It loves gay marriage. It views it as a sacred act. It has the exact same view of social justice, of mass immigration, of like things that the Bible doesn't really say anything about. The Bible doesn't really say anything specifically about economics other than kind of some general guidelines. But like the church doesn't have any particular insight into what the tax rate should be, how much market versus central planning you should have. These are kind of things that are left up to like the secular government, and while they should be from a Christian perspective, it's not really specified. But somehow the Bible 100% supports their affirmative action policies. I think probably like the most base example of this is the Bible very clearly states in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. That doesn't mean like taxation or criminal penalties aren't legitimate, but it's wrong to break down someone's door and take their stuff, and it says that in any number of places. But you have all the progressive Christians who are like, oh, it that doesn't apply because if minorities feel upset, then it's okay for them to like riot, loot, and steal stuff. It doesn't apply in that situation. It doesn't apply in that situation, but it does apply when I don't know, companies overcharge for something, or in some way that's like advantageous to us personally. And it's, I don't know, there are right wing people who are like this, like particularly when you get into like National Socialists who are like Catholics or something, who will like say, oh, Catholicism supports every aspect of National Socialism. Well, that's not true, really. There's a lot of like reconciling and trying to kind of figure out complicated issues involved in reconciling any kind of political ideology with fairly orthodox, with a lowercase o, Christian beliefs. And I know, maybe to give a real world example, this happened in Quebec and a lot of different Western European countries. Is Catholicism does very much teach the older concept of social justice, which is not what we understand it today. It's just a fair shake for the working class, and it's trying to treat like the individual worker as a whole person. So the idea was to kind of create a middle way between communism and capitalism. And the upper class at the time tended to be more conservative because they wanted to maintain society as it was, with themselves at the top, and also there was the fear of communism. So in Quebec, for instance, they had a very conservative right wing government for a lot of the 20th century. But the government there, because they were afraid of communism, was extremely anti union and very kind of at odds with workers. And that was kind of partially what led to the collapse of Quebec into liberalism and secularism, was they weren't willing to kind of reconcile their state Catholicism to kind of the political realities. And like they really should have, because as I said, well, Christianity doesn't give an exact prescription for what wages should be or what rights workers should have. Generally speaking, the concept of treating your workers and paying them and giving them as much rights as possible is a Christian idea. Christian charity is like a real thing. But because they weren't able to really properly reconcile stuff, it kind of led to a disaster. So I hope that all makes sense. I hope that was kind of interesting and maybe gave you a bit of insight. Um, all I can say really is God bless. Um, Peace be with you and with your spirit.